find him. You've done this before. You can do it again. Let the flames burn within you. No. Let them burn without. Come to me, Ifrit!
It's not still just love. Oh, but I did not find it never was nothing. Shaking in this land. It's not good for season. Oh, the earth is gone. If I let you do this, these are high speeds.
So to say Final Fantasy has a bit of a contingent history would be a bit of an understatement. The original games are regarded as classics, and the games that happen later on are the source for much discourse in terms of the fandom, or in gaming in general. I myself have a bit of a history with Final Fantasy as well, but I will not get into too much detail in that regard. But I will give my quick thoughts on a few games that I have played and my opinions on a bit of the quote-unquote downward spiral that the series was kind of going on. Now, Final Fantasy VI is pretty good and is really underrated in terms of the series as a whole. People generally talk about Final Fantasy VII onwards while ignoring 6. When, funny enough, there is a bit of a discussion of which game is better, Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII, due to, well, 6's narrative being really solid, where the villain kind of wins halfway through, but despite all that, you actually still get your party back together and you still try to kick his ass. Final Fantasy VII is, well, a classic, and there's not much for me to really bring up or actually add to this conversation, other than, well, it's a great game, and any JRPG fan worth his salt have already played this game and knows the story and characters through and throughout. 8 I have not played, 9 I have not played, 10 on the other hand is actually my favorite in the series. Yeah, that might piss some people off, but I don't care. It's still great. Its story does have some issues, and as much as I like Spoonie's video, I do disagree with him some aspects in terms of narrative, but in terms of gameplay, it's still pretty solid. It still has some great moments throughout, and I will occasionally go back to it whenever I'm bored or whether I'm in the mood to play a JRPG game that isn't Persona or Shin Megami Tensei. 12 is rather meh, honestly, in some regards, and people aren't really wrong. I have not played the game in over a decade, so I don't know what I can actually add to the conversation other than, it's okay. The main character you're playing, you're technically not the main character of the story. That's actually a different character, or is that's how I remember it. I don't really know. But yeah, 12 is a bit of a contingent, even though it has its fans like many other games in the franchise. 13, on the other hand, good grief, what a mess. Like, legit. Everything fundamentally about that game is it's fundamentally fucked. There is nothing redeeming in that game, just on an objective level. The combat extremely streamlined, you might as well be holding down a button the entire time. Leveling up is garbage, the story makes no sense and is complete trash. The main characters are annoying and absolutely stupid. Snow is possibly the worst character in that game and possibly Troy Baker's worst role, dub-wise, and that's saying something.
Trenchcoat, where you going?
Date with the Foul Sea. Got some things to talk about.
Lightning might be the only character that's worth a damn, but even then, that's probably a tribute to the actress actually somewhat trying for that role. Even then, her character writing's still a mess. Spoonie's video is probably the best thing that came out of that game.
Hello, does anyone want to help this guy? He looks like he's about to fucking die. I don't know where we are. I don't know who anyone is. I don't know what the rules are. And I shouldn't have to read a fucking novella of footnotes to have this explained. And when the footnotes fail to explain its own fucking terms, I don't even know how to define what a complete failure at even the most fundamental aspects of storytelling this fucking is. This goes beyond fundamentals. This is almost experimental in how dementedly antithetical this is to how anyone else in history would ever write a story. I never even heard of something like this before. Fucking Joseph Campbell's head would explode in Lovecraftian insanity just trying to figure out what raving fucking lunatic thought anyone could follow anything that happens in this game, much less have the patience to even try. Fucking cave drawings from the Aurignacian period had a smoother narrative flow than this.
Sarah saved us!
Bullshit she did! What is this, like a theme or something? It's only been 2 hours of gameplay. 2 fucking hours! And we've already seen characters fall from absurd heights and hit the ground at unbelievable, unsurvivable speeds and just walk away without so much as messing their hair up 3 times. 3! Fucking Looney Tunes had more lasting consequences for falls like this. At least Wile E. Coyote would walk around smooshed like an accordion or something for a few fucking seconds.
Hell, he even pointed out some things that I even actually missed upon first playthrough. And the same could be said for the entire trilogy, like, as a whole. 13-2 was forgettable, 13 Lightning Returns is somewhat okay, only by the prospect that you get to play Lightning again. That's about it. Then, a few years later, 15 came out, which was originally Versus 13, somewhat taking place in the Christophus games. I forgot what the actual name is, I'll display it on screen, but it was originally supposed to come out amongst the games alongside 13. It was Type 0, 13, Versus 13, but Versus 13 had several delays, several issues, and was remade several times into eventually Final Fantasy XV. And I would have liked to have seen what the plans originally were, because they were very different than what they actually ended up being, as not only evident by the cut content of 15, but also the massive story changes that 15 undergone. You are no longer playing this revenge narrative, you are playing something completely different and almost feels disconnected in a way. There was nothing really linking you to the main character. And not only that, it didn't help that the game wasn't even finished on release. Its story wasn't complete. It also relied on you going through external material like watching Kingsglaive in the anime, as well as going through other material. The DLC was also supposed to fill in gaps with your other party members, which some were not even finished. You had to go through other external material just to see how that turned out, and had you played the game vanilla, you would realize there is this massive gap in the game near the final endpoint. Yeah, it is a mess, and arguably possibly just as big of a mess that 13 was, albeit for different reasons. And because of that, 15 felt like it was false advertised in a way. And I won't lie, after some time, after beating 15, I kind of was burned on this series for a good while. Sure, I still like 10 and 7 and 6, but yeah, I felt myself agreeing with Spoonie more and more as time progressed. Even when 16's trailers dropped, I was still very skeptical of what this game might be. Sure, the trailers actually made the game look really cool, the graphics looked neat, the combat looked neat, the summons looked cool, the icons looked awesome, but the game wasn't out yet. I was still burned on 15 and I kept my mouth shut. Sure, it had promise, but again, I waited until other people played the game, including friends I knew IRL, and hearing how good it actually was, I decided, well, what the hell, might as well get it anyway. And I will tell you, Final Fantasy XVI is a damn good game, and get ready for this, possibly the best Final Fantasy game we have gotten in a long ass time. So yeah, let's jump right in for a bit. Now, gameplay is good, but it has some hiccups. There is no strategy in gameplay like previous games. There's no turn-based, similar to 15, but even more streamlined in a way. Unlike 15, where there were elements of the turn-based RPG aspect of previous Final Fantasy games, there is none of that at all in here, which is fine in terms of combat. That's actually okay. The combat is serviceable, especially when you get the icons later on as the game progresses, but what sucks about it is the fact that, well, you do get parties kind of in the game. Different characters will join you as the story goes on, but you do not control them. The only character you actually control is Torgal, the dog, which kind of sucks, meaning when Sid or Jill or other characters are in your party, you can't really tell them to do anything, and it's just AI taking care of the rabble, which really sucks, especially when you have Sid, who he himself is a dominant, and he does have magical abilities he uses in combat. It just sucks you can't, well, tell him to use any of them. So the hacking and slashing is basically up to you and Torgal, which is fine. But again, To also add on, combat is good, but is also very simple. Now, it's nowhere near as in-depth as Devil May Cry. There are no multiple combos to use and unlock, so to speak. The combat is mostly based on how you use the icons and your magical abilities in combat and which enemies to use them on, and you knowing how long which ability cools down, so you know which ones to use more, while the ones that are most powerful you save for the more tougher foes or use them as crowd control. That's understandable. But the basic combo is not that in depth, it's just one combo you actually have. Sadly, I can't really show you my gameplay because I do not have a capture card, but if you play the game, you kind of know what I'm talking about. I found myself most of the time, whenever icons were cooling down, just found myself spamming square over and over and over again, while occasionally dodging. Sure, you do unlock more abilities, like holding square down, you getting a more powerful attack, or you pressing square and X at the same time, you getting a new attack, but again, some more basic abilities would have been nice. Another thing to add is during the Ifrit sections, some of them are rather quick time fests. Granted, what is going on screen is great, but they do not grant the player that much control. Several sections are on rails, but they're rare, to be frank. That's not every boss with Ifrit, and the final boss in particular is actually really badass because you have more control. It's just, I wish that was every boss. I wish that, say for example, Titan, and this is a slight spoilers, when you go up against him in his final form, like when you're running, it is on rails. You're not actually controlling Ifrit. You're just moving him out of the way and making sure he doesn't get hit or hurt at all, which is okay. It's just, it takes control away from the player. And it gives a sense that the game's kind of holding your hand in a sense. But that does not change the fact of what's going on screen is fantastic. I mean, you're literally playing this massive Attack on Titan level scale battle. And the game does do a really good job of making you feel like a god on a battlefield whenever Ifrit is summoned. The original soundtrack is really good. The final boss theme in particular is actually really great. Battle music is good, but I will say a bit of a hot take, it's not as memorable as 15's, I would say. 15 I think had a better soundtrack in some sense, but 16 definitely has several tracks that are really solid. And a little pet peeve, I will say, and this is a minor nitpick, is that not every boss fight has their own theme. You're very much hearing like the standard boss battle theme, if you know what I mean. Sure, Titan and Ultima, the final villain, do get their own themes, but that's not everybody. Now, Clive, the main character that you play, is possibly one of the better MCs in the Final Fantasy games we have gotten in a long ass time. Mostly because, well, one, we're actually involved in the story, two, we see him grow as the game progresses, and three, he's, well, acted pretty well. His props to his voice actor for doing a good job and for actually giving a shit. Jill, the love interest for Clive, is also a great character, and also I would add that the romance in this game is actually pretty good, and one of the better romance I have seen in a pretty long time. Also, Sid in this game is probably one of the better versions of Sid we have also gotten in a while. The dude is loyal, a good friend, and you actually wished he was in the game the entire time, and slight spoilers, he actually isn't, which is a damn shame. But even when he isn't there, his presence is felt throughout the narrative, which is just good character writing in on itself. Now, the antagonists of the story, I think, are pretty solid. They're, as mentioned before, with not only Clyde, but other characters as well. The entire cast does a great job voice-wise, and I will actually go as far as to say there isn't really one weak link the entire time. Everyone gives it their all. The bad guys, you actually do get a good presence in the story, unlike 15 where you barely saw them and there was this massive disconnect between you and the game because of it. But because 16 here actually shows you the villains and what they're planning and what they're scheming, and a little behind the scenes. You get the sense that you are affecting the world, that you are a part of this narrative. And also, Ultima, the big bad final villain, actually feels like he has a presence in the game. But a little hot take here, I will definitely say the Mother and Odin felt like they were better villains of the story because we see them more. That doesn't take away that Ultima definitely feels like he is the ultimate threat as you get to him in the final climax, which is actually built up pretty damn well. Now the plot of the game is pretty solid. The beginning is somewhat familiar for many typical fantasy fans or, well, readers of typical literature. How it starts out is very Hamlet, if you know what I mean, and you pretty much already know how the story starts just from me making that comparison. Granted, that's not the whole narrative. Clive doesn't actually go out to get his father's throne because, well, by the time he's already an adult, the throne is pretty much gone. The kingdom has actually been absorbed into the empire, and his mother is already fucking the emperor. But that's not where his calling is, and his calling is to something else. But regardless of that, you actually do feel involved with the story, you feel involved with the plot. There is no real disconnect between player and character like there was in 15. I'm gonna keep mentioning that because 15 and 16 do have some similarities, but how they're constructed and how their narratives flow are very different, and one is clearly done better than the other. Another thing to point out is the odd comparison to Game of Thrones. Now, other than one character, and that would be the mother, there aren't that many things in this that really feels like Game of Thronesy or Song of Ice and Fire like at all. To be frank, the story did not at all feel like a grimdark or even a dark fantasy at times. Like, sure, yes, characters swear and there is blood and there is violence and there is some sex and nudity in the game, which is a shock especially for a Final Fantasy game, which is good seeing that leap that Square decided to take with this series. But it never felt like a Martin story. It felt more a Brandon Sanderson or a Robert Jordan narrative rather than a, well, Martin one, because of how their stories are actually written. Sure, there are some dark things that actually happen in those stories, but there's still a light at the end of the tunnel. Our characters are still the good guys, and they do ultimately win, albeit at a cost, as opposed to Martin or Abercrombie or any other grimdark author where their worlds are filled with bastards. There's no good guy. Everyone is technically a villain in their own right. The best characters, morale-wise, either end up getting used or are killed early on in the narrative, and that the world is very grim and bleak. Here, that's not the case at all. Sure, there's some dark things that are happening, but there is effort to fix the world. Another thing to note why this plot is actually good is that it is a complete narrative. There is no complete stinger for DLC like there was for 15. There is no sense that a story just happened off screen like there was in 15 with certain gaps in the narrative. It never felt like that at all. The game you played, the narrative you played felt complete, and it felt good once you completed it. It never felt like you had to go elsewhere to understand what was going on. You got everything. You got who was who, you got whose kingdom was where, you understood the faction, and you understood where they were on the world. Granted, it takes time, but it is nowhere near as bad as 13's god-awful world building or 15's lack of world building. Some gripes I do have with it, though, are that there are some aspects that do feel predictable in some cases, especially for major Final Fantasy players and nerds like myself. The stuff with the crystals I thought was kind of obvious and could have been seen a million miles down the way, but I was okay with it because it was nowhere near as bad as 13's, to be frank, where there's this massive disconnect between you and the characters. Another thing to actually mention is that, and this is a personal thing, it would have been cool to play the 13 years that Clive was serving under the Empire during that little time jump. It would have been neat to have done a few more missions working under the Empire and fighting a few more battles under the Legion, which as an Imperial slave warrior, which would have been neat. But when we meet him, he's basically on his way out, which is fine, and it works in the narrative, and you do get the sense that it's just aimless in that his entire life at that point was basically just a killing machine serving one purpose. But again, maybe that may be the Abercrombie fan in me talking. I don't know, but it would have been neat to have seen it rather than it being glossed over. Now, without spoiling too much, the ending is actually really good. It's sad, bittersweet, and impactful, but the end credit scene does make things worth it. You see life is flourishing, you see that the world is actually in a better place, and that everything that our characters actually did was in fact for worthwhile, regardless of the cost. Other things that I would like to mention as well is that, and these are just personal gripes that I actually have to close things off, is that, as mentioned before, I would have liked to have played the 13 years of Clive being in the Imperial Slave Regiment. I actually liked Clive's design at age 28. The Imperial armor and branded tattoo, it would have been neat to have at least customized that. And also another thing, there's no customization at all. There is no outfits. You do not get to decide how Clive looks. The only thing you actually get to choose how he looks is his sword, and that's about it. Crafting is very basic. All you get is the gauntlets, which you don't see, his belt, which you don't see, and a sword, which is the only thing you see, which is a shame. And it sucks that all that was just streamlined and cut out, kind of cutting and removing any personal gameplay like element that you could have added to the game. Like, again, it would have been neat to have played the entire game while in that Imperial slave armor, and it would have been neat to have mixed and matched like certain sets and designs, which it's a sad thing that you're not going to be able to do that at all. Granted, the game's still great, this game still plays well, it's just a minor thing, and it really sucks, to be frank. Another thing is that you cannot customize the party you're in at all. It's based on the story and who can actually join. So you can't really pick Jill on a whim. You can't pick Sid on a whim. You cannot pick the other characters on a whim. The only ones that you're stuck with is just Clive and Torgal, which is fine, but again ties into the whole you can't really strategize at all, which is a damn shame. But other than that, like, that is rather minor in some aspects. The game was never really advertised as a party game, to be frank, and it's quite clear Final Fantasy has moved further and further away of its turn-based roots upon each installment. To some that's a good thing, to some that's a bad thing. To someone like myself, it would have been neat to have something in the middle for a game like this. I, for one, would have preferred if 15's combat was somewhat improved upon, like merging the combat of this and from the strategy of 15 rather than just doing away the strategy aspect completely, but whatever. So those are pretty much my thoughts on Final Fantasy XVI. It's a solid game and one I do recommend to many fans of the franchise. Like I said before, it's possibly the best game in the series, period, and it actually is a pretty good starting off point for newcomers who want to jump in. It's definitely better than the previous games, that's for damn certain. And on another note, this is just a quick FYI. Yes, this is on the Decent Descent channel and not on my review channel. Usually when I do reviews, I do it on my personal review channel. But since Decent Descent technically is kind of a gaming channel in some aspects, I decided to drop it here. Now, be sure to let me know in the comments whether you like that or not. This is just something a little bit new because I haven't done a gaming review in ever, to be frank. And it would be nice to hear some level of some feedback, and if y'all want me to review more stuff gaming wise, be sure to let me know. And I myself also have plans of reviewing some other games that I personally like. Now in time, I do plan on getting a capture card so I can record my own gameplay for them. I do have emulators on my personal computer, so that isn't too bad. But for games on my consoles, that's going to be a bit tricky, so I'll have to get a capture card for them and then transfer some footage, and there we go. But other than that, for now, for the time being, I'm going to have to be borrowing some footage from other channels, and obviously credit to them in the description. But other than that, I guess I'll just end my little retort there. So yeah, if you like the video, you know the usual stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the usual jazz. Take care, stay chill, wanderers.